Who funds Bitcoin Core? This is a hot topic these days. A lot of people asking this question. Bitcoin Core has to be funded somehow, so where's the money coming from? Well, I'm answering this on the Bitcoin Season 2 breakdown today, and I'm going to use this report from 1A1Z, which was published in October 2024. So the data is relevant up to that time, although a little bit has changed. And I also want to say, I have some personal opinions that I'll give at the end of this. But as the report says, Bitcoin protocol development is funded as a decentralized project with no funding. This is a really good report. I recommend everybody check this out. 1A1Z is the name of the group that put this together. And it's kind of a who's who has read it, reviewed it, contributed towards it. So for a lot of the crypto people, you might ask, isn't there like a foundation who funds Bitcoin Core? How big is the treasury? You have the Solana Foundation, the Ethereum Foundation. These are these entities which are kind of in charge of those blockchains and protocols. That doesn't really apply to Bitcoin. There's no foundation. None of those questions are relevant when you're dealing with a decentralized protocol like Bitcoin, which has no centralized group which allocates capital. This is kind of a practical challenge. Bitcoin is today, $2 trillion network with no foundation that, quote, governs it. And therefore, there really isn't a profit motive to work on the development of the protocol itself. You see a lot of companies who work and build on Bitcoin work on, say, applications or their mining or their venture. There's not that many groups. There's actually you'll find a surprisingly small amount of people who work on developing the protocol itself. There's a difference between the protocol and the dominant client implementation. Bitcoin Core is the dominant client. Currently, over 80% of all nodes run Bitcoin Core. At times, it's been 95, 99%. And Bitcoin Core has dozens of active contributors and several lead maintainers, currently 5. Their work is often funded by grants or done for free on occasion by enthusiasts. So, even though Bitcoin has the largest cryptocurrency by market cap, its ecosystem spend is actually pretty low. Bitcoin Core funding was, according to the report, $8.4 million in 2023. While that might sound a lot, think about it. Bitcoin is $2 trillion in total market cap, and the annual spend on Bitcoin Core was only $8.4 million. Of that spend, 1A1Z tracks that there are 13 active organizations at time of publishing, and those 13 organizations have deployed 8.4 million. They're fairly transparent in how much they contribute. A note about these organizations: 8 of these organizations are reliant exclusively on donations to fund operations. That is different than, say, a revenue-generating company. I'm going to use the example of like BitMEX or Maelstrom Capital, which is a for-profit entity which donates to Bitcoin Core contributors. 8 of these organizations are, however, not revenue-generating, and they just rely on donations. The top 3 of these 8 entities, as measured by capital raised, received 62.25% of their aggregate funding from a single source. We'll get into that later. And one more last general comment is, if we're going to compare like Bitcoin development compared to like other crypto, let's look at Polkadot. If Bitcoin had the spending that the Polkadot Foundation equivalent does on protocol development, then that would roughly equate to about $600 million per year for Bitcoin. So compared to other major blockchains, Bitcoin has a very, very low developer funding amount. Another foundation thing is there is no necessarily official list of people who are allowed to contribute. This is open for anyone to contribute and write code for. And so we have this emergence of what we call core contributors or developers and core maintainers. We count developers as having at least 5 commits, and maintainers are individuals with merge access to the Bitcoin Core GitHub repo. There are currently 5 of those individuals. There's a bunch of other people. There's researchers, testers, specific engineers who do things. The number of developers as measured by 5+ commits was pretty low. Only 41 active devs so far at time of publishing this report in 2024. So there are many organizations that have funded Bitcoin development, Bitcoin Core. Currently, there are 13 active at time of report. Here's a kind of chart to visualize it. On the left, you have the ones which are funded via open donations, and over on the right, you see ones which are private funding. You see OKX and Maelstrom, which is an exchange, and Arthur Hayes' venture, Blockstream and Chaincode, which are private companies. And over on the left, you see more open donations, OpenSats, which would be like Matt Odell, Btrust, which is Dorsey and Jay-Z, and some other people like the HRF. How much funding has each of these organizations deployed? Here's another good chart. This kind of gives you a good visualization. The bigger the circle, the more money they've deployed into Bitcoin Core grants, not their total budget overall, which may go to other things besides Bitcoin Core. For example, OpenSats does like a lot of Nostr grants. But this gives you like an idea for like rough size of these entities. So the notable ones are Brink, OpenSats, Chaincode, Spiral, but you can see HRF, Blockstream, OKX. I'm going to skip over like where these organizations are located and where their grants go to, like what part of the world and which developers they go to, but they're pretty distributed. There's a little bit of concentration in North America, but overall it's like a pretty distributed, both geographically and jurisdictionally. Let's go to the Bitcoin Core maintainer timeline. I think this is probably pretty useful for people who don't know, who aren't familiar with the history. So remember, Bitcoin Core maintainers are individuals with merge access to the Bitcoin Core GitHub repo. There are currently 5. You see them here. Some of them are more like well-known in the public eye, like Gloria Zhao and Ava Chow and maybe Michael Ford Fanquake. And we can see that here are the 3 entities that each of them is employed full-time by. So this is a fairly low number of entities for the folks who are, you would say, have the most soft power for the actual merging of Bitcoin Core commits. Where does the money come from across the ecosystem? Well, the report doesn't get into every single donor, but it does focus on one, and that is Jack Dorsey. Here we can see that a very significant amount of funding for some of the larger organizations that fund Bitcoin Core contributors and maintainers come from Jack Dorsey himself. OpenSats is 90% Jack Dorsey funded. B Trust is 50-50 between Dorsey and Jay-Z. Brink is 15% funded by Jack Dorsey. Spiral is funded by Block, which is CEO and owned by Jack Dorsey. And the Digital Currency Initiative has an undisclosed amount from Jack Dorsey, but there's relative size, 8 to 10 million. Now, those are just the funding for those organizations and don't necessarily equate exactly to how much those organizations have written to Bitcoin Core contributors. But we can definitely see that Jack Dorsey among these is the most prominent and accounts for maybe ballpark half of the money going into the various organizations which do write checks to and fund Bitcoin Core contributors and developers. It's important to note that 1A1Z did a lot of interviews with people in the ecosystem, and none of those interviewed by 1A1Z were significantly concerned about Jack's influence over these organizations. There are some areas to improve, though. In the report towards the end, we see that, as I said, there's only 41 developers with at least 5 commits from 2024. That's a pretty low number for a $2 trillion network. Now, there's more people with maybe a single commit, and not all commits are created equal, and some may be just a single syntax issue, whereas others may be major overhauls. There's a low proportional spend of only 8.4 million roughly in 2023. There is some jurisdictional centralization. 6 of the most significant orgs are legally registered in the United States. There's not a lot of places you can get a full-time job working on Bitcoin. In fact, there's only these organizations which actually do full-time employment as opposed to just one-off grants. And one of the big ones is Brink. Of the 5 Bitcoin Core maintainers, 3 are employed by Brink alone. I want to comment before people get too fuddy that I think the folks over Brink, Mike Schmidt in particular, have done an incredible job on a very comparatively low budget, doing a very good job having this role in the ecosystem. I endorse those folks over there, but at the same time, it is quite concentrated that we have that 3 of 5 Bitcoin Core maintainers from a single company. And then we have funding centralization. Jack Dorsey is, quote, currently a material donor or sponsor of at least 3 key orgs. And then we also have kind of this question of funding sustainability. There's a difference between getting just a grant, which is perhaps a one-time thing, versus sustained commitment from revenue-generating entities. So there's not that many of these revenue-generating entities like OKX, Maelstrom, or Blockstream. So it's time for my opinions. My opinion is that the concentrated funding of Bitcoin Core is not something we should be worrying about too much right now. I personally know a lot of folks working in this space, and I endorse their good intentions and neutrality. I would like to rather encourage more organizations, companies, and individuals to take proactive approaches to funding Bitcoin development, whether that be funding Bitcoin Core contributors or other types of Bitcoin developer activity. I recommend checking out other reports and research from 1A1Z. They have an interesting one, which I might do as my next video, on client comparison. That would be, say, looking at Bitcoin Core, Bitcoin Knots, LibBitcoin, and perhaps historical client implementations. And I'll also say that this is the first, that this 1A1Z report on Bitcoin funding is the first in a 3-part series. I don't think the other 2 parts have come out yet, but I would love to take a look. Thanks again for listening. If you got a question, drop it below. Otherwise, catch you all next week for the next breakdown.